صباح الخير شكرا أهلا
Good
وسهلا
morning,
بالجميع.
thank you, and welcome
Welcome
everybody.
Mushta. You know we're going to be speaking in Arabic here,
Mushta,
but we'll be waiting
we
for
will
you
be speaking
to join
in
us
Arabic.
in the session. حقيقة راح نحاول نختصر ست
We will try
موضوعات
to
كل
be
واحد من
brief. There
موضوعات
are 6 topics.
بساعة وكمان عم
Each
نحاول
one
نختصر
will,
دكتور 30
all
سنة
of
من
this will be
التجربة
covered in 1 year. We
مع
have to summarize
أمنيات
30
فعلا
years of
يعني
experience.
ربما ليست لغدا
It's
لكن بكل وعي
not something
كامل
that will
الوعي
happen tomorrow,
يعني
but we're being
جميع
fully
الأوراق
conscious. All the papers
لحجم التحدي
are aware of
تفاصيل
the
المشاكل
challenges,
اللي
the
انتم
details,
كحكومة
the
عم
problems
تحاولوا
that you as the
تتعاملوا معها
government are trying to
وصعوبة
deal
ذلك.
with, and how difficult
أظن
this
أنه
is.
فائدة
So
مثل
I
هذه
believe
النقاشات
that these discussions
ابتداء
are
من هذا الجلسة
important.
الأولى
Starting
فائدتها
from this
ليست
first panel,
ضرورة آنية
the use is
بقدر
not
ما هي
only what
تحفز
happens
التفكير
now, but it motivates
ندرس
thinking
البدائل
and reviews
نتحاور ما
alternatives
بيننا
and creates
وأيضا
this
مع
discussion among
هؤلاء
ourselves and discussion with
الأساتذة اللي انضموا
these
لنا من
experts who joined
مختلف
us from different
جامعات لكن
parts and
جميعهم
universities.
نفس الهم إنه
They
نعمل
share the
الأفضل
same
الممكن
concern. We need to do the
نتعلم
best possible,
من تجربتنا
learn
ومن
from our
تجارب
experience
الأخرى.
and from the
بالتالي
experiences of
الجلسة
others.
الأولى صممت
So the first panel
كإطار
was
عام
designed
للأوراق
to
الأخرى
be a general
اللي
framework
تدخل
of the
كل
other
جلسة
papers, each
وكل
of which
موضوع
will
بالتفصيل
delve
محور.
into a
فعلا
specific
التقاطع
detail,
ما بين
and
المحاور هنا هي
this
ليس محاور هكذا رتبناها
crossing
لهذه الندوة
between all the themes
لكن
is
ما
how it was
بينها
organized for the
وما
webinar.
بين ما
But they
يتم
also
وضعها
intersect
كخطط
with the
حكومية
plans that are
فعلا
being
أنا بلاقي
prepared
في
by the
تقاطع
government. So I
إيجابي
believe that this is a positive
وتغذية
intersection,
متبادلة
and
ممكن
it
كمان.
is a
وأكيد
mutual
نحن
feedback.
ماس دائما
And
جاهز
at MAS, we are
للاستمرار في دعم
always
جهود
ready
الحكومة
to
قبل
support
أي
the
جهود
efforts of
أخرى
the government
لكن بالتعاون طبعا مع كل
and others
هؤلاء الشركاء
in cooperation
إن
with
كان
all our
المجتمع المدني أو
partners,
القطاع
civil
الخاص أو حتى
society, private
الشركاء
sector,
الدوليين.
and international partners.
بشكل مختصر الدكتور ماهر عاد
Very briefly,
ورقة
Dr.
نحن
Maher prepared a
يعني طلبنا
paper
منه إنه يعمل
in which we
مش
asked him
تقييم لكن استنادا إلى
to
تجربة
carry
السياسة
out
التنموية
not an
الفلسطينية
evaluation, but
الفلسطينية
also what is the
كانت
Palestinian
قائمة
economic
قبل
experience
23
before
في ضوء
2023.
ما تكبده
In light
الاقتصاد
of
الفلسطيني الأرض الفلسطينية الشعب
the
الفلسطيني من
losses endured by the Palestinian economy and
مسائل
people,
من اعتداء
the attacks.
هل
In
هناك
light of
عودة
all this,
إلى نفس
is there
السياسات
a
اللي كانت
return
قائمة
to the same
قبل
policies that existed
أم
before
أن الحرب
2023,
وحدها
or
ليس فقط تجربة ال30 سنة
has
لكن
the
الحرب
war
بنفسها
alone,
فرضت
not only the experience over the past 30 years,
مفاهيم
but has the
جديدة
war alone imposed
مراحل جديدة
new concepts,
للتعافي
new
بالتالي يعني
stages of
بتضل الرؤى
recovery?
البعيدة مهمة
So
لكن
the
واضح أن
long-term
الرؤى
visions remain
يعني رؤية
important, but
التعافي
it
فيما
appears that a
قبلها
vision of
الإغاثي
recovery
فيما قبلها إعادة
must be
التأهيل
preceded by
وما بعد
relief,
يعني وهكذا.
rehabilitation, and other steps.
ففعلا نحن أمام تجربة جديدة تماما.
It is a totally new
على
experience
الأقل
to
في
us,
آخر منذ
at
تولي
least
السلطة الفلسطينية
since
إدارة شؤون
the PNA
الحكم الفلسطيني
started
الاقتصادي وأمام
since its advent to
تجارب يمكن
govern the
بدنا
Palestinian
نفكر
people.
يعني
So we
لأي
have
مدى
to think
نقدر
of these experiences
نحافظ
and to
عليها
what
من ناحية
extent we
التوازن ما بين
can
السوق، كيف
preserve
نصلح
this
السوق،
balance,
كيف
how
نعزز
can we
الأسواق، كيف
improve
نفس
our
الوقت
markets, and at the same time
الشأن العام يبقى
the public
في
affairs
مقدمة
remain a top priority.
السياسات والإجراءات. على أي حال الدكتور ماهر
دكتور ماهر
عندك ربع ساعة.
You have 15 minutes.
ما تريد.
I will try in this paper to present the key points in the paper. The paper was sent to you and you can read it through the link that was shared with you. The main topic here is a war-torn economy. What are the possible approaches for a war-torn economy? And in the near future, we know that we cannot speak of even a medium-term vision for 5 years because of the recent developments, and the external impacts we have, but we can only speak of the near future for 1 or 2 years. And even in this near future, there is there are diverse probabilities of what could happen in the next year or next 2 years. 2 years. The paper covers 4 points: the existing situation, the key challenges, and the third and fourth points are two scenarios: an optimistic scenario and a less optimistic or more realistic scenario. And what are the possible and necessary approaches in each one of these scenarios? Of course, regarding the first point about the existing situation, in the speech of His Excellency the Prime Minister, he mentioned the key indicators: the destruction of the economy in the Gaza Strip and West Bank, the collapse of most economic indicators in the West Bank, loss of over 1/3 of GDP and GNP. All of these are in the paper and they are known to all the participants in this webinar. You are all aware of these statistics. So let's come to the next point, which is the key challenges. We can speak of several challenges, but we can focus on 5 key challenges. The first one, which is very important and it relates to the Gaza Strip, there's the question of reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, of course, but as we know, this particular issue can be taken as an example of how to identify the so-called the next day, the political context that may produce very different results. This example of the Gaza Strip, for example, we mentioned during the 7th or 8th month of the war, President Sisi estimated the cost of reconstruction of Gaza by $9 billion. In the same month, Rand Corporation gave other estimates of about $80 billion. This was before the Israeli army continued its destruction of Rafah and the remaining areas to the south of the Gaza Strip. These estimates are not based on surveys on the ground, and they are mere projections that cannot be validated without an assessment on the ground. And there are the estimates of the United Nations, which say that before the reconstruction, there is the question of removal of rubble. And removal of rubble alone will need 14 years before we can start the reconstruction. But in this paper, we speak of a different challenge. This challenge is first to accept that reconstruction will not start immediately after the war, because the first priority is relief of the people to provide the basic needs, including medicines, food, shelter, and urgent shelters, basic income, social security, and social care. But from an economic point of view, how can the government or the PNA manage this process, whether during the stage of humanitarian relief and then the reconstruction? How can it manage this process within a national and holistic economic developmental vision that is approved and that enjoys consensus? So how can we reintegrate the Gaza Strip during the humanitarian relief and reconstruction phases to the rest of the territory? How can we reintegrate the Gaza Strip in the general economic framework of both parts of Palestine and reunite this economy? There are several studies carried out by Mass Institute in the past years before the war. We were speaking of 4 totally separated parts of the so-called Palestinian economy. We have areas A and B, which have their own legal framework. There's East Jerusalem, which is separated and dealt with differently. The Gaza Strip, which is under ongoing siege, and Area C in the West Bank, which is also managed in a different way. So we need to reunify all these parts under one framework. And regarding rebuilding the Gaza Strip, we need to manage the process so that it make it an integral part of the national entity. So this is a role of the economy to reunify. The second challenge relates to the deteriorating situations in the West Bank with the spread of unemployment. We need not delve into details. You all know the reasons behind this, and this represents a major challenge for the Palestinian National Authority. The third challenge is the ongoing deterioration of public revenues available to the Palestinian Authority and its treasury. And this leads to undermining the ability of the government to provide basic services on a consistent manner from time to time. The fourth challenge is the risk that threatens most of the economic pillars, including the banking sector. The banking sector is facing several tremendous challenges. It lost all its activity in the Gaza Strip. These are kind of what of debt, and they face also the ongoing threat of disruption of all relations with Israeli banks, in addition to the major crisis regarded to the exchange rate of shekel and its impact on different Palestinian banks. So this is an example of the key pillars of the Palestinian economy, like the pharmaceuticals and other industries. But here I'm taking the banking sector as an example, and they are facing these risks. The fifth point relates to the P&A economic policy. It is necessary to reconsider the P&A economic policy since a quarter of a century, since the Second Intifada. The Palestinian successive governments, all of them, have focused on addressing two gaps or two crises. The first one is the fiscal deficit, and the second one is the trade deficit. So this has been the focus of most of the policies of Palestinian governments in the past 25 years. And they deal with these gaps as such to try to address or reduce the fiscal gap or deficit by increasing the trading gap. It means by encouraging trade, promoting importation in particular, because this represents a key source of increased revenues through clearance funds. So increasing revenues through clearing funds contributes to partly bridging the fiscal gap. This policy is sterile because it comes at the expense of other productive sectors. There are several studies that say we need to see another gap or another deficit, which is the deficit in economic resources, deficit in resources, and try to address this deficit. Treating economic resources deficits comes only by expanding the productive economic activity. So we need to reconsider the economic policies. We come now to the next part of the paper, which is the two scenarios. There are several scenarios, but for simplifying our discussion, we speak of two scenarios. The first one is optimistic to a certain extent. And the second one, if it is not pessimistic, it is at least realistic. The first scenario says that it is possible through consolidated international and regional efforts to impose a total end of the war. That is full withdrawal of Israel from the Gaza Strip, putting an end to the siege on the Gaza Strip and lifting all the restrictions on the West Bank and starting an international initiative to negotiate for a political settlement and a two-state solution. All of this will lead to a number of activities. It will first give a flow of assistance into Gaza without restrictions, whether it be for humanitarian relief or reconstruction efforts. Also in the West Bank, it will open Area C to the Palestinian economy for private or public activities. And this will entail additional international assistance, and it will create an enabling environment for local investment and international investment. So this is the optimistic scenario, and it requires tremendous efforts to mobilize regional and international powers to impose an end of the war on the Palestinian territory. And this is the starting point proposed by the paper, is to return to the signed agreements and to implement many of the provisions that have not been implemented to date, including, for example, the other stages of redeployment of the Israeli army, which is mentioned in the agreements, and the transfer of all civil authority to the Palestinian Authority, and to put an end to the civil administration in Beit El, in addition to repatriation of those displaced in 1967, and this is one of the provisions of the agreement signed, and to start operating the two safe corridors between the Gaza Strip and West Bank. There are many provisions that can represent a first step of recovery in this scenario. The other scenario, which can be optimistic or realistic, there could be in the near future some sign of a ceasefire in Gaza, but there will not be an end of the war, at least from the Israeli point of view. And this is the declared position by the cabinet coalition in Israel. This means that we may achieve a ceasefire, but Israel will continue its suffocating siege on the Gaza Strip. It will continue all pressure and restrictions on the Gaza Strip, including preventing any Palestinian activities and seizing funds and so on. This will lead to several outcomes. There is a report by UNCTAD which says that in a post-war situation, if the Israeli siege on the Gaza Strip continues, OCHA says that reconstruction of the Gaza Strip will need 350 years. Based on the performance assessment in past years, there were some assistance that was coming in, but because of the Israeli siege and blockade, it will need 3 centuries to rebuild Gaza if the siege continues after the war. Under this reality, we need to shift at the PNA and the government from business as usual to declaring a real state of emergency. There are articles in the Palestinian Basic Law to organize the state of emergency. The authority declared a state of emergency during COVID pandemic, and it was implemented over several months in 2021 and 2022. The state of emergency will give the government additional powers to enable it to reallocate resources and priorities of budgets in addition to undertaking all the necessary measures to confront the existential threat that Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are facing now. And it will be, of course, different for Gaza. If the war continues with a ceasefire, it means that the Israeli cabinet coalition will continue to implement two key plans. The first one, the so-called the general plans, which is to continue the ethnic cleansing in the north of Gaza and to divide the Gaza Strip. The second plan is the settlement plan, which was pronounced by Smotrich a few years ago, and it shifts the annexation from the existing situation to a legal situation. So there is a de facto annexation now, but it will be a de jure annexation. Under this general framework, we need to recognize that we are in a state of war and that we are managing an economy under war. We need to redraft our economic policies to confront this war. Therefore, we can be inspired by our Palestinian heritage. In the past 40 years, the Palestinian experience in creating an economic public sector in the diaspora for the refugee camps and the civil society action during the first intifada and the creation of local development, which was called the steadfastness economy at the time. This is not a unique or exceptional experience for Palestine. In the paper, we mention an expanded report issued by the World Bank on the experiences of several societies that faced similar obstacles and challenges, and they confronted it with steadfastness economy and localization of development. It's participatory development with contribution of the civil society in development, and the role of central government and donor countries to lead these efforts to achieve the so-called steadfastness and to achieve agreed upon national goals. So this is the general picture that I wanted to present to you, and it is covered by the paper. Thank you, Dr. Maher. Now we will give the floor immediately to Thank you, Dr. Muhammad.
You know, Dr. Mushtaq, he was one of the very first to start on giving the lectures at Yusuf Sayef symposiums. He is a researcher on Palestinian issues and on building the state, a Palestinian state. He's now working with us on a topic that's very important. We hope that the content would be very important and useful for you on evaluating the political economy for the day after and the Palestinian national cause.
I have a lot of things to say, but we'll give you the first chance to comment on the discussion so far. You know the work that we're talking about, so please, from Dhaka in Bangladesh, where he's now working as an advisor to help the new democratic, let's hope, government. Dr. Mushtaq Khan, tfaddal, it's yours to take over.
Thank you, Raja, and thank you, Mas, for inviting me to this important conference. Let me begin by saying that I completely agree with everything that has been said before, including by His Excellency the Prime Minister and Dr. Maher. I want to just add a little bit of analysis behind this. I think what has happened since October 7th, where Israel has now been internationally accused of genocide by different countries, where, as Dr. Maher said, there is now 14 years of rubble to clear, where there is 350 years of reconstruction coming. Why has this happened? And I think it cannot be explained by saying that Israel got very angry and overreacted. It is not overreaction. I believe it is a fundamental change in strategy that has been brought about by October the 7th, and it opens up new possibilities but new dangers, and we need to understand this. What I would say from the theory of political settlements is that any agreement, a peace agreement, can only be sustained if both sides agree that it is the best deal they can get, given their understanding of their relative power. And power is not just economic and military power. Power is also ideological power. Dr. Maher talked about Sumud. Power is also the power to construct organizations. But let us go back to Oslo, because my work in Palestine began with Oslo. Oslo seemed to offer a deal which was aligned with the distribution of power. Israel would get 78% of historic Palestine, and it would give up territory that at that time nobody in the world recognized as Israel, and in exchange it would get international recognition and peace. And what happened after that was that Israel, and this was our first book on Palestine, we showed that Israel deliberately made that impossible. It constructed more settlements, it disrupted Palestinian rights, it made it impossible to reach an agreement. I think what that shows is something that people don't really yet fully understand, that the issue is not a settlement in line with the distribution of power, but that actually Israel does not want a settlement. Israel doesn't want the conflict to end. This is a very strong statement, but I think I can argue very strongly that that is the case. You go back to Ben-Gurion, and Netanyahu is his direct successor, and they have both said there is no solution to the Palestinian problem. It has to be managed. Why do they say that? They say it because imagine what would happen if there is a solution. It doesn't matter. It's a one-state, two-state, or three-state, or four-state solution. As soon as there is a solution, whoever is left within the territory that Israel claims is its territory will have a significant Palestinian minority who will demand equal rights because the conflict is over. And that is the end of Zionism. Zionism is a system of differential rights. It is not just differential rights in Gaza and West Bank, it is also differential rights within Israel. Israel has to maintain these differential rights because it is not about territory, it's about Zionism. So if you think that the two-state solution was disrupted by the settlers coming into the West Bank, my argument is that is wrong. The settlers are not powerful. It's the deep state in Israel which is powerful, and they pushed the settlers as a strategy to disrupt the two-state solution, not the other way around. So why did the deep state want to do this is something that Palestinians and their friends really need to understand. But I will park this for now. What happened in the next 30 years of post-Oslo is a period of low-level conflict that was managed by Israel, and we have to understand that that was Israel's preferred option. That wasn't the failure of the political settlement. That was the political settlement. That was the settlement that Israel wanted. And that settlement was kept with a distribution of power that had three components. The first component was Israeli violence against any Palestinian rights movement, whether this was house demolition in West Bank or the Gazan movement for land rights, where snipers shot unarmed kids. That was the first strategy. The second strategy was what they called mowing the grass. they would go in, and as soon as some organization was identified, they would kill and disrupt that organization. The third was, and I say this with regret because I know many people in this room will find it problematic, but I think it is really important to understand. The third part of this was the dependence of the PNA on Western funding. And that Western funding came with this idea that the conversation on the two-state solution has to continue, even when everyone knew it was going nowhere. So these three elements are the basis of the political settlement of the last 30 years. 7th October destroyed this political settlement in some really important ways. Firstly, it demonstrated that mowing the grass doesn't work. It's not enough, because the new technologies of warfare, which includes drones and missiles, can now be constructed in small factories underground. And this happened not just in Gaza, it happened on a bigger scale in Lebanon with Hezbollah. And what we now see is that in the past, Hamas would take 1 or 2 hostages or kill 1 or 2 people. On the 7th of October, they were able to take hundreds of hostages and kill more than around 1,000 people. And Hezbollah was able to displace tens of thousands of Israelis from northern Israel. This is unprecedented. It means that the military intelligence and economic strategy of Israel has totally failed. You cannot understand the Israeli violence and the Israeli genocidal activity unless you understand that its military, economic, and intelligence strategy is finished. Okay? Now, the problem is that even if it is demolishing Gaza, there is no guarantee that if there is peace, in 4 or 5 years' time, even more weapons will not be constructed, even more successful drones will not emerge, and that Hezbollah will not come back after the ceasefire with even more deadly missiles. There's no guarantee. And paradoxically, so what we see is that in every conflict with the armed wing of the Palestinian movement, the armed wing is getting stronger relative to Israel, even though it is totally defeated every time, and now we are seeing another defeat. There is no guarantee that the next round will not be worse for Israel. Okay, so this is their perception, this is their nightmare. Now, the second point is that, paradoxically, this activity has also shifted the rights movement in the West towards the Palestinians. Young people are shifting towards the Palestinians in large numbers. Those two things together means that the political settlement of the last 30 years is over, the controlled low-level conflict is finished, and a new Israeli strategy has emerged. That new Israeli strategy is to permanently destroy any capacity of the Palestinians to exercise resistance. And they say that they don't want to destroy Hamas, they want to destroy the capacity of Hamas. Now, and of Hezbollah. Now, what does that mean? That means that you cannot leave anyone in Gaza or in Palestine who in 5 years could make drones or who could make weapons, which means actually ethnic cleansing. It's not just about killing the current leadership of Hamas, it's about getting rid of the human capability to resist. This is actually the strategy. Now, I think you need to understand that the deep state in the US also understands this strategy. And because they have nothing better to offer Israel, they are going along with this strategy, but at the same time saying it's very unlikely this strategy will work. So see the contradiction. They are giving Israel the bombs and the money to continue with this strategy, but saying we do not think it will work. Now, what is it? That means they have nothing better to offer, but they can't say to Israel, don't do this, because they know there is no return to the past 30 years political settlement. This is the conjuncture that we are in. So I would say exactly what Dr. Maher said, I would say it even stronger. The second strategy that he is talking about, that is a kind of ceasefire without an end of war, is actually the only option. But there is another option, which we haven't discussed, which is that Israel actually carries out the genocide. it actually carries out the ethnic cleansing and moves large numbers of people out. I think this is extremely unlikely, but it cannot be ruled out. That is their strategy. Now, the implications of this for Palestinian reconstruction and Palestinian strategy, maybe I will come back in the next round because I can see Raja has lifted his mic. So I will say that what we are now in is the end of the first phase of the Israeli strategy. And I will end by quoting someone who is no friend of colonial people, is Churchill. And Churchill will probably turn in his grave to know that I'm quoting him in this context, because Churchill was not a friend of Muslims, was not a friend of colonial people, but as a war strategist, he was brilliant. And if you remember the Second World War, one of the turning points was the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt, when the German forces, using their strategy of rapid mobilization of tanks to capture territory, which they called blitzkrieg, which had been successful all in the first couple of years of the war, at El Alamein, that strategy failed because the British found a way of stopping that. And Churchill said something really interesting then. He said about that battle that this is not the beginning of the end. It's not the turning, it's not that from now we will start winning. It's not the beginning of the end. After the El Alamein battle, the Germans won lots of battles. But what Churchill was saying, it's the end of the beginning. It's a really important point. It's not the beginning of the end, but it's the end of the beginning. It was the end of the successful German strategy of blitzkrieg. Now, what I think 7th of October represents is not the beginning of the end. There's a long way to go, but it's the end of the beginning. The low-level conflict maintained by Israel for the first 30 years after Oslo is over. And I think what we have to discuss is what that means in terms of Palestinian strategies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mushtaq. We have a لا هون اوكي. أول مداخل اتفضل.
يعطيكم العافية وأسعد الله صباحكم. اسمي
Good morning. My name is Haitham Azarbi. I'm a board member and I'm also a lawyer. I would like to comment on something that Dr. Maher Al-Kurd has mentioned, which is this declaring the state of contingency or emergency. He probably meant it from a political perspective or economic perspective. However, for us as lawyers, we see it as a threat, especially from a legal perspective. I have participated in drafting the Palestinian law. Many of the jurisdictions would be under the executive power.
والقضائية والى آخره. فأعتقد أنه يجب التعامل مع هذا المصطلح بحذر وبحذر شديد، لأنه مش ناقصنا إحنا يعني بهذا الجانب. الشق الآخر اللي بدي أحكي فيه.
The other part I want to cover, in addition to the suspension of laws, I felt that the Prime Minister was frank and he reflected the reality without any exaggeration. But I felt there were a few things missing, but they can be done. I think that speaking of reconstruction with these figures, I don't think that there is reconstruction without a legislative and real judicial framework. Can we imagine the judicial plan after the war? Everybody agrees on this. All parties agree on this. We need to start doing this, and we can start it now. How will the courts operate? Can we imagine the number of conflicts that will arise after the war in the banking sector? The guarantor died, the real estate part of the collateral was destroyed, the heritage issues, inheritance, and so on. So this is an exceptional situation, means that we need legislation that would enable the Gaza Strip to stand again on its feet. But to speak of general policies and framework, I believe that we have an opportunity now and certain silver lining to prepare a framework that can help the Gaza Strip stand again after the end of the war. Thank you. I reiterate that a summary of the discussion will be published, and it's important to listen to what is mentioned here and there. Thank you. If you have questions to the speakers, thank you very much. Dr. Rayan Darwish. I am a servant at the Ministry of Economy, but I'm also a researcher and a farmer. There is systematic Israeli destruction of Gaza in order to plant its settlement expansion, and there is systematic indirect destruction by Israel of the West Bank with support of the settlers. We speak of practical solutions, not academic solutions. What we're saying that on the other, to face this, we need systematic reconstruction of the West Bank towns and villages in order to repatriate those who left Gaza and other parts of the West Bank after the war. I believe of the important mobilization of resources and practical solutions to support the agricultural sector and to provide the necessary resources in this sector. We have solutions, we have something that is not in anywhere in the world, which is areas A, B, and C. So practically speaking, is areas A and B. Where are the delimitations of areas A and B, the land that can be reclaimed and farmed? We have many expatriates and unemployed that can do that. So we need to focus more on agriculture. And a final point, so I need to ask a question. The second point, area C. There are some areas in C that are easily accessible and they are close to B and they can be farmed. And there are areas C that are difficult to access or impossible to access. So I believe that we need to allocate support to the seeds, fertilizers, and water to support agriculture. Thank you. A question? The last intervention, because we will try to respect the time. And then we'll come back to Dr. Maher and Dr. Mushtaq. Saad Abdel Hadi. What I'd like to say is I'd like to commend what Dr. Maher has said about declaring a state of emergency by taking into account some of the legal considerations mentioned here, because the most probable scenario for the next stage is not an end of the war. The most probable scenario, whether it be in Gaza or in the West Bank, is the ongoing siege and annexation of Area C and so on. So politically, we are moving toward a stage that requires a reconsideration of everything. So we cannot continue to work with business as usual, as it was said, at several levels. So the only solution is to reconsider everything. This means that we need to take into account the legal issues and all frameworks that must be taken into account. But declaring a state of emergency became a requirement now. Thank you, Saad. So the purpose of this discussion is to listen and discuss. I will comment on two main points. The first point about the state of emergency and the second point about agriculture. For the state of emergency, it is necessary to read the basic law, the Palestinian basic law, and the articles related to the state of emergency. There are 4 provisions, Article 10 on, and these speak of protection of human rights, liberties, civil rights, and so on. So if all these articles relating to the state of emergency are applied, there will be no legal risk, as it was mentioned. But what is meant here is the economic part, is to reallocate the economic resources and freedom of this, of rearrangement of priorities and reallocating the budget items and how to prioritize our relationships with donor countries to support different activities. All of these require a state of emergency. The second point regarding agriculture. A few months ago, a workshop was organized by MAS for all partners in the agricultural sector. There are 2 points. and this is part of the tasks of the government, is to lead this issue. First, one of the officials represented in this workshop said that the central markets of vegetables and fruit, that is the fruit and vegetable market, or that's called HISBA, 20% sell local products and the rest come from other sources. For example, onions and garlic are imported from China. So this is very important point. So when we speak of agriculture, it relates to a very particular issue that was mentioned in several parts of the paper, is to replace imports by local products. So I have to quote a report of the first industrial survey carried out by the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, in the 1980s, 1984. And it quoted several studies, because the survey that was carried out by UNIDO in the early 1980s concluded one main thing. It was about the West Bank only. The West Bank market has become captive of the Israeli economy. The commodities, the Israeli commodities that are being marketed, whether it be agricultural or industrial, food processing, and so on, all these products that are being marketed in the West Bank, they used to be produced in the West Bank in the 1950s and 60s, or can easily be produced in the West Bank. So this is a question of replacing the imports. When we speak of agriculture, the problem is importing agricultural products. 80% of the market of every vegetable market is non-national products. So this requires that we redirect our policies and protect our national products. Thank you, Dr. Maher, Dr. Mushtaq.
Including minutes of this session to add to your already alarming, but in some ways encouraging view. Go ahead, please.
So I think it's important to understand that someone in the audience said it's not business as usual. It is absolutely will not be business as usual. I think it's really important for us to understand how significant the shift in the Israeli mindset has been. And even if Netanyahu goes, any Israeli leader will continue the same strategy, because the deep state strategy of Israel is now to completely undermine Palestinian capacity of resistance. This is not possible, but this is what they will try. Now, here is the problem for us. If you think about law and agreements, laws and agreements are only enforceable if both sides want them to be enforced, including the powerful side, which is Israel. Even the laws and agreements of the Oslo period were not enforced because Israel didn't want it. Now, how are we going to fight Israeli approach to create mayhem and forced migration with laws and agreements? I think we have to think outside the box. The only way you are going to stop the Israeli aggression and use this turning point to the Palestinian advantage is to actually build on the very thing that the Israelis are scared of, which is not the agreements. What they are scared of is a restructuring of Palestinian power. And this is why I was so pleased to hear the Prime Minister talk about the joint activity between the Gaza administration and the PNA and the Palestinian administration on the West Bank. This is a precondition. And the Palestinians have to work very closely to convert this mobilization into a mobilization for rights, not a mobilization for piece of territory here or a piece of land there, or this area of Zone C should be for farming. It should be a movement for rights. It's a new movement, a movement for rights for not just for national determination, but for water, but for housing, but through free movement, and keeping in the background and not giving up at all the right of colonized people to armed resistance. This is a very important, I mean, this armed resistance part of it has been so critical in changing the narrative that the Palestinian people must directly and repeatedly say, we reserve the right of armed resistance, even though we will not use it now. This combination of a rights movement plus the right of colonized people for armed resistance is what is keeping Israel up at night and which has completely changed the calculation. We now have to maintain that process of pressure because really, I think Palestinians need to understand it. The fight now is about the end of Zionism. That is what is coming. Whether you want a two-state solution or a one-state solution, you are not going to get it as long as Israel wants to maintain differential rights. So the strategy has to be about forcing Israel globally and internally and through the Palestinian organized power to understand that Zionism as a system of differential rights in any part of these territories is over. Only then will Palestinians be free. So, my friends, it is not about just, economic strategies in the short run. They're very important. But now you are actually fighting the last phase of your struggle for independence. And your economic strategy has to be aligned with your political strategy, your rights strategy. And this is why it's so important that all these different things come together, because actually this conflict is now in its final and most intense phase. It's not going to go back to the normal. It's not going to go back to what it looked like the last 30 years. It's going to be a different animal from now on.
Mushtaq, I'm going to keep you for another 2 minutes because a few questions are on Q&A, which is all about this end of the beginning. And one of them is whether or not, meaning that does this mean we're at the beginning of the end of the low-managed conflict, which means we're moving into a high-intensity conflict period. As another one is, what do you think the implication of your analysis is that we are now at the end of the beginning of the low conflict stage for PA policies or measures? And the third one was the new Zionists who are in charge now in Israel, this is the end of the beginning of Zionism maybe, and is it the beginning of a totally different Zionism? 2 more minutes since it's Churchill seems to be more relevant than we could have believed. Yes, Faddal. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So I think that, if you look at the economic strategy of the last 30 years, certainly as the PNA understood it, it was really to keep this conversation going about the two-state solution, which everyone knew was not going to go anywhere. But in the middle of that, there was enough funding coming in to allow health, education, and so on to be delivered. That was the settlement, right? Now, if it is clear that this conversation is not going to even start because it's not going to go anywhere and everyone knows it's not going to go anywhere, and Israel is trying to actually conduct genocide, then clearly that space for Western money coming in to deliver health and education has to be completely rethought. So this is one consequence of what does it mean for PA policies and measures. They have to be, radically rethought. But in terms of what it means for the Palestinian broader movement, it means that we have to get out of thinking of operating in the Oslo period, the low-level conflict period, where there was a kind of fake war going on, but a lot of activities going on, which is about passing resolutions in the UN or passing resolutions in different places and so on. This is now completely futile. I think that what is absolutely clear now is and I think that regardless of what we think, Palestinians in the street and Israelis in the street and Hezbollah in the street and the Middle East as a whole have now understood that Israel can be defeated. And this is a completely new phenomenon. And that means that it is no longer going to be, Israel is so powerful, it can just mildly disrupt things here and there and keep going. Israel has to now show that it is going to completely destroy its enemies. And even the Americans think this can't be done. So actually, let me put it very simply. The last remaining Israeli strategy, their biggest ally thinks it won't work. But their biggest ally is not being able to stop them from doing it because their biggest ally can't offer them anything better. And I think the biggest ally and nobody else realizes that a two-state solution will not be accepted by Israel. So that's not a solution, because a two-state solution results also in the end of Zionism. So if the Israeli goal is to preserve Zionism, the two-state solution ain't the answer. The one-state solution certainly is not the answer. So actually the goal of the Palestinians should not be about one state, two state, or three states. The goal of the Palestinian movement should be about rights and expose the fact that Zionism is a differential rights system. And once Zionism goes or is defeated, actually you can have a two-state solution, one-state solution, or a three-state solution. That choice is later on. But the first fight is about Zionism, and that's what this fight is now about. It's exposed. The fight is not about the two-state solution or the one-state solution. This is a fight for the heart of the Israeli strategy, for the heart of Zionism. And the Israelis understand this, which is why they are going mad. That is why they have gone nuts. This is not a small war about, you attacked us and we're going to teach you a lesson. This is a fight about the very survival of Israel as a Zionist entity.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, please. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kurd. Thank you, Dr. Khan. Next session will begin immediately.